Good morning. We'd like to welcome you to another edition of the Sunday School Review. This week's Sunday School lesson is entitled Faith Amidst the Fiery Furnace, and is taken from Daniel, the 3rd chapter, verses 19 through 28a. Now, Daniel, that is the book of Daniel, features the life and times of Daniel. And Daniel is the author of this book. And Daniel himself was taken captive to Babylon as a teenager during the siege by Nebuchadnezzar. And this, the book of Daniel reveals two notable miracles. The first one is in our lesson today, that is the deliverance of the three Hebrew men from the fiery furnace, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the other notable miracle that we're going to discuss next week is Daniel's deliverance from the lion's den. Okay, but this week is the three Hebrew men that were delivered from the fiery furnace. There are two outlines in our lesson today. The first outline is faith risks, and that's the 3rd chapter, verses 19 through 23. And the second outline is faith reward, that is verses 24 through 28a. Now, in the 3rd chapter of Daniel, we see in the first verse, that is verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. Basically, Nebuchadnezzar made a statue of himself. We see, let's go down to verse 4. It says, then an herald cried aloud to all, to you, it is commanded. So Nebuchadnezzar made a commandment of, said, O people, nations, and languages. Verse 5, at the time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kind of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. So, as I said, in verse 1, he made a statue of himself, and he ordered everyone to bow down to this statue, that is, to worship him as a god. So Nebuchadnezzar, as you can see, he was full of pride. And so he ordered everyone to worship him, basically. And let's look at verse 7, part of verse 7. So therefore, at the time when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, the flute, basically all kind of music, they fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. They worshiped him as king. Now let's drop down to verse 12. We're still in chapter 3. Verse 12 here. Verse 12 says, there are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the providence of Babylon. Okay, let's name them: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. In other words, these three men who you have set over the affairs of the providence. Now, Daniel is not mentioned here. We're not talking about Daniel. Daniel is not We don't know where Daniel is at this point here. But these Daniel and these men, they held prominent positions in the kingdom. Okay, Daniel, as you know, Daniel was an interpreter of dreams. So Daniel had a prominent, his position was more prominent than these men. But all of these men, that is Daniel and these three Hebrew men, they all held prominent positions in the Babylonian Empire. So as verse 12 says, these men that you set over the providence, that is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are not bowing down to your image. That's the word, according to verse 12. Let's go to verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage, he was outraged. When he heard this, he was furious. Then Nebuchadnezzar was raged. His fury commanded, bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. They said, bring them here. Bring them to me. That's what verse 13 said. Bring them here. Verse 14. Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said unto them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not ye serve my gods? Now this is a little G though. Do you not serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? In other words, you're not worshiping me? Is it true? And this is what he asked them. Is it true? Verse 15 and 16, I'm not going to read that, but he basically said, I'm going to give you a chance to redeem yourself. I'm going to give you a chance to redeem yourself. I'm going to give you a do-over, okay? So, and he said, okay, get another shot at this. And verse 10, I'm 16, I'm sorry. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. Basically say, okay, you can give us another chance if you want to, but we're not going to bow down. We're going to trust our faith. And now that was verse 16. Okay, let's go to verse 17. If it be so, this is them speaking. This is the three Hebrew men speaking. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. Okay, those are some bold words. I mean, you can talk, but they're going to get a chance to back it up. In other words, basically, can you back it up? We will back it up. Let's go to verse 18. He said, but if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Now their faith is being tested. Be it known, our faith will be tested also. Maybe not to this extent. Their faith was tested by their life. Now, as I said, our faith will be tested too. Maybe not to this extent. Your faith may be tested for maybe $500. You say, well, if I answer the question this way, I'm going to lose out on getting $500. That might be your test of faith. But whatever it is, your faith will be tested. But they were putting their life on the line. Not a few dollars, not a few $100s. They was putting their life on the line, okay? So their faith would be tested of how true you are, how much your allegiance is to your God. And we're going to see the extent that they was willing to go in testing of their faith. Okay, now our lesson starts at verse 19. That was just background as to what had transpired, what led to the situation that these three Hebrew men got themselves into. That's how they got there, by not bowing down to the image that Nebuchadnezzar had made of himself. They said, we will not worship any other gods. Nebuchadnezzar wanted everyone in the kingdom to worship him. They said no, and they was willing to back it up, put their life on the line. Okay, let's go. Our first outline, as I said, we have two outlines. First outline is faith, risk. That's verses 19 to 23. Let's start with our first set of scriptures, verse 19. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his vestige was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In other words, he was mad. Therefore he spoke and commanded that they should heat up the furnace 7 times more than it was before. Okay, so they heated up the furnace 7 times. They made it 7 times hotter, getting ready to throw these men into the fiery furnace, which they did. Okay, let's go to verse 20. So the three Hebrew men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to worship Nebuchadnezzar. That's the bottom line. Verse 20, he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. He ordered his strongest soldiers to bind them up, and throw them into the fiery furnace. Verse 21, then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, their hats, their garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. In other words, clothes and everything. They didn't strip them down. They just bound them up with everything on and threw them into the fiery furnace. In other words, they were given an opportunity. We have a law in Michigan and many states as it relates to self-defense. They call stand your ground. And this is what these men did. They stood their ground. They said, we're not going to bow down. We're not going to bow down. They stood their ground. Okay, and verse 22. Therefore, because the king commandment was urgent, in other words, we want this done expeditiously now. And the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire slew the men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In other words, the fire was so hot that it consumed the men that was throwing them in, that threw them in. That had to be hot. It was so hot that the men that was throwing the three Hebrew men in were consumed. Not also consumed, they were consumed. Okay, there was no also, because only they were consumed, not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay, let's go to 23, which is the last verse in the first outline. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So basically, they threw them in. That's what happened. They threw them in. The men that threw them in were consumed. Okay, and the three Hebrew men, they fell into the fire. Okay, now the second outline starts at verse 24 and it's faith rewards, and it goes to verse 28:8. Okay, let's read faith reward. We're going to see where God redeemed them. God came to their rescue. God came to their rescue. Verse 24. Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, were astonished and rose up in haste and spake and said unto his counselors, did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, true, yes. Okay. And 25, he answered and said, lo, I see 4 men walking in the midst of the fire. They have no hurt, and the fourth, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. Basically, now he double checked. Didn't we cast in 3? Yes, we did. But I see 4 in there, and they're walking about, and the fourth looks like the Son of God. So he recognized, that is, Nebuchadnezzar recognized the divinity, that this fourth one was divine. He says he looked like the Son of God. And this is the takeaway here. So back to verse 18, which, like I said, was not in the lesson. Well, 17 and 18, which is not in the lesson. We read it earlier. Said, this is the men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, speaking. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand. But if not, be it known unto thee that we will not bow down. So God, as they were saying, well, we basically don't know how he's going to do it, but we have faith that he will deliver us. And in this particular situation, it's like they say, he got in the fire with them because they threw in 3 and there's 4 in there. He was in there with them. So it's like your situation, we don't know. God can get into your situation with you. They was walking around in there. We're going to read what happened to them, or what did not happen to them, actually. Okay, but God was in the fire with them. Okay, and the fact that he was in there with everything was cool. Everything was cool. No problem. Okay, that was verse 26. Well, actually 25, 26 is coming. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the most high God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. They walked out of the fire. Nebuchadnezzar came up, said, well, come here. Call him by name, come here. And they walked up out of the fire. And let's go to 27 and see what happened to them. And the princes, governors, captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, they were there. They saw these men. They were eyewitnesses. They saw these men. Upon their bodies, the fire had no power. That's number 1. Nor an hair on their head singed. Neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed over them. They were, and also notice they were not bound. Remember, they was bound when they was cast in. They were walking around in there, and once they did come out, they walked out on their own accord. They walked out, and there was no smell of smoke, neither an hair on their head singed, and no smell of smoke on them at all. And they witnessed this, as well as the king. So God protected them. We see on display here clearly the power of God. We see on display the power of God. God protected them in the fire because they had faith. The power of faith. This is what this is about. The power of faith. Okay. And in verse 28, which is our last verse in this lesson, it says, it's actually verse 28a, the lesson goes to 28. It says, then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him. Now, Nebuchadnezzar and all these men that were there, the counselors, king's men, the governors, his princes, governors, captains, king's councils, all these men saw this, as well as King Nebuchadnezzar. They could not deny that they had witnessed a miracle that day. They could not deny that a miracle had not taken place. So as this lesson goes, faith tested. And will you maintain an allegiance to God? And as I said earlier, all of our faith will be tested to some extent. Maybe not to the extent that these three men, faith was tested. And next week, as we talk about Daniel, faith being tested while he's in the lion's den, our faith may not be tested to that extent, but be it known, our faith will be tested. And the question is, will you maintain an allegiance to God? These men, these Hebrews, Daniel, as I said, which was not in the fiery furnace with them, but Daniel, which will be covered next week, Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel, these Hebrew men, they from their youth was taught only worship God. Nebuchadnezzar, because of his pride, had made a statue, said, you, everybody, worship me. And they said, no, we are not going to worship any other gods. We're going to remain true to, we're going to keep our allegiance to the God of Israel. So when it comes time for us to be tested, are we going to stand our ground as it relates to keeping our faith and trust in God, as these men did? Okay. And this is our lesson today. It's dealing with the three Hebrew men trusting in God to protect them from the fiery furnace. And we need to have faith in God that he will deliver us from whatever consequence, whatever circumstance we may face. And that's what we should do, is to keep our faith in God. And that's our lesson today. We'd like to thank you for watching. We ask you to join us next week for another edition of the Sunday School Review. Thank you.